It all started with a whisper from Brussels, a leak so small it could have been dismissed, but the words inside carry the weight of an economic bombshell. Behind closed doors, Donald Trump, standing before NATO allies, delivered a chilling demand. Raise tariffs on Africa, make them bend or watch them starve. The target was clear: Africa's raw lifeblood. Oil and gold, two resources without which Western economies would stumble overnight. Trump feared that if BRICS locked these resources, Washington's grip on the global order would shatter. For Africa, the message was brutal: either surrender sovereignty or face economic suffocation. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't tremble. He identified it for what it was: economic hostility presented as diplomacy. Instead of remaining quiet, he readied a response. What unfolded next would rattle Africa, NATO, and the entire world. The leak was never random. It came from inside the very room where the decision was made. During a closed-door meeting in Brussels, Washington pressed its allies hard, raised tariffs on Africa, cut them off until they returned to dependence. The message was blunt and the targets were clear: Africa's oil and gold, the lifeblood of entire economies, the twin resources without which Western industries would stumble overnight. Most European leaders stayed silent, but not all. Among them sat one who couldn't bury his conscience. He understood the implications of such an action. It was economic warfare presented as diplomacy. A fresh round of hardship would be inflicted upon millions. Yet speaking out publicly would have been political suicide. So a different choice was made. Late that night, a single page from the classified memo slipped quietly into the hands of an anonymous European journalist, not through official channels, not for power, but as an act of quiet resistance. The journalist's report was short but explosive. Washington had pushed Europe to secretly prepare tariffs designed to choke Africa's oil and gold exports, forcing the continent to kneel in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré didn't see it as rumor. He saw it for what it was: a declaration of war on Africa's dignity. The news spread rapidly. Within hours, rumors of the leaked document were circulating through African capitals. Local news outlets ran headlines like, "Europe targets Africa's oil and gold." On social media, young voices asked the same question: how long will we let them dictate our future? In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré wasted no time. He summoned his advisors before dawn. The mood was tense but steady. "This isn't about tariffs," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is about control. They want our oil, our gold, and our sovereignty. If we bow today, we'll be slaves tomorrow." By mid-morning, emergency calls went out across the Sahel, Mali, Guinea, and beyond. Traoré called for a meeting not of diplomats, but of leaders who grasped the gravity of the situation. Within a few days, a private summit was in progress. It was held not in Paris or Geneva, but in the center of West Africa. Behind heavy doors, the air was thick with defiance. Each leader spoke of the same pattern: gold siphoned out through shadow contracts, oil fields dominated by foreign firms, revenues disappearing overseas, while villages remained in poverty. For the first time in decades, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about begging for aid. It was about standing together. And Traoré set the tone: if they dare impose tariffs, then we will dare something greater. We will shut down the flow of oil and gold to their markets, and we will find new partners who respect us. The room fell silent. Then one by one, leaders nodded. The decision was risky, dangerous even. But in that moment, Africa's divided voices started to unite into a single, firm response. News of the summit's decision leaked quickly, not through official communiques, but through the voices of ordinary people. Radio stations carried fragments of speeches, and soon the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey were alive with chants. If they want our oil and gold, they'll have to take our dignity too. Markets buzzed with tension. Merchants whispered about the possibility of higher prices, about shortages that might come if Europe really raised tariffs. Farmers in dusty villages asked whether their harvest would still find buyers. Mothers worried about school fees, about medicine, about the thin line between survival and hunger. But another feeling, pride, burned beneath the anxiety. For decades, Africans had seen their oil extracted and their gold taken away. All the while, they were instructed to be thankful for loans and assistance. Now, for the first time, their leaders were daring to say no. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a young student held a sign that read, "Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century." The crowd roared in agreement. Traoré understood the cost. He knew that freezing exports would tighten belts across the continent. Yet when he appeared on national television, his words resonated deeper than any promise of comfort. We may suffer in the short term, but suffering with dignity is better than living forever on our knees. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. People who once felt powerless started to view themselves as participants in a larger cause. The whisper transformed into a unified chant. "Stand firm, we support you." The shock inside Europe was immediate and undeniable. Markets that had long considered African resources as background noise suddenly realized they were staring into an abyss. In Frankfurt, traders watched gold prices climb like a rocket, their screens flashing red with each uptick. In Paris, energy planners quietly admitted that more than half of the uranium powering France's nuclear grid came from Niger, a lifeline now under question. And in Milan, executives from Europe's electric car industry gathered in a panic without cobalt and lithium from the Congo. Their factories would stall, their green revolution collapsing before it could even take root. But the most dangerous pressure point of all was oil and gold. African oil drawn from wells in the Sahel and shipped through the Gulf of Guinea kept Mediterranean refineries alive. African gold, with much of it passing through Burkina Faso and Mali, supported the financial stability of entire banking systems. These two resources were not optional, they were essential. And now Traoré had placed his hand firmly on the valve. In Brussels, ministers scrambled into late-night meetings. For years, they had spoken in public about partnership, about aid, about shared growth. Yet the memos on their desks told a different story, one of dependency. Europe needed Africa far more than Africa needed Europe. And for the first time in decades, everyone in the room knew it. Inside the closed chambers of Brussels, the debate turned raw. Washington's voice dominated the call screens, insisting that Europe must stand united behind tariffs and financial restrictions. "Africa will crawl back," one American advisor declared, "once their treasuries run dry." But the Europeans in the room did not all nod. Some stared at graphs showing refinery shutdowns, bullion shortages, and cobalt contracts already slipping into Chinese hands. They were aware that penalizing Africa could backfire with shocking quickness. A German minister voiced the initial dissent. "If we sanction them," he stated, "we sanction ourselves." His words hung heavy, but he did not dare push further. To openly oppose Washington's line would be political suicide. So instead, whispers of doubt spread quietly in corridors, never entering the official transcript. Meanwhile, opposition parties across Europe smelled blood. In Berlin, lawmakers asked why ordinary workers should pay the price of a tariff war against Africa. In Paris, unions warned of layoffs if gold markets were disrupted, even in London. Commentators on late-night programs began asking the unthinkable, have we underestimated Africa's power? But Trump's voice was louder than anyone else's. At rallies broadcast worldwide, he vowed to put Africa in its place, presenting the crisis as a challenge to Western power. The audience cheered, but diplomats listening from other countries heard something else. As Europe wrestled with its divisions, BRICS nations moved with silent precision. In Beijing, trade officials announced emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks entirely. Moscow sent delegations offering joint ventures in gold refining and oil drilling, promising that no tariff could touch a barrel once it was rebranded under Eurasian contracts. New Delhi stepped forward with perhaps the boldest gesture, a pledge to purchase Sahelian crude in long-term agreements, guaranteeing a market even if Europe turned its back. Each step sent a clear signal. Africa would not stand alone. In Ouagadougou, these offers arrived like lifelines. Yet Traoré and his allies in the alliance of Sahel states exercised caution. They were aware of what was at stake. Making deals with outside powers too hastily could lead to a new form of dependency. So they moved deliberately. Teams of economists and engineers were dispatched to secure stockpiles of oil and gold. Border troops fortified mining zones, ensuring no sabotage could choke supply at its source. And in the heart of the summit, leaders began drafting a framework not for survival, but for sovereignty, an African resource charter that would treat oil, gold, and other raw materials not as commodities, but as instruments of independence. For decades, Africa had been forced to react, begging for aid, scrambling under sanctions, adjusting to terms set elsewhere. Now, for the first time, the continent was setting the rules of engagement. And as the lights in Brussels burned late into the night, Europe's leaders realized the unthinkable. The balance of power over oil and gold was no longer theirs to command. The counterattack did not arrive with tanks or missiles. It unfolded discreetly, using the language of finance and technology. Within days of the African Defiance Summit, European banks started to freeze accounts associated with state-owned enterprises in Burkina Faso and Mali. Cargo ships loaded with crude oil and bullion were delayed in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork suddenly under review. Insurance firms, all based in Western capitals, refused to cover African shipments, leaving exporters stranded with barrels of oil and gold. They could not move. Then came the digital assault. Anonymous cyber units probed government servers in Ouagadougou and Bamako, crashing websites, disrupting financial transfers, and targeting the very systems meant to safeguard resource flows on television screens across Europe. Coordinated media campaign painted Traoré as reckless, a populist strongman dragging his nation into ruin. Editorials warned that Africa's gamble would result in famine and turmoil. They predicted that everyday Africans would turn on their leaders once the difficulties became severe. However, the situation on the ground presented a different picture. Yes, fell priests rose. Medicines grew harder to find. Families felt the strain of shortages. Yet rather than break under pressure, communities began to close ranks. Volunteers distributed food in rural villages. Students organized solidarity networks to keep schools running. Farmers pulled resources, ensuring harvests reached markets without relying on foreign intermediaries. What was meant to fracture Africa was paradoxically welding it together. The escalation came swiftly. Unmarked drones began circling over Sahelian skies, their shadows gliding across desert sands. Officially, they were monitoring operations, but everyone knew surveillance was just the beginning. In the coastal ports, shipments of African cocoa and coffee suddenly faced tariffs 3 times higher than before. What were once considered partnership goods were now being used as leverage in a harsh economic standoff. In African capitals, alarms sounded daily. Power grids experienced outages after cyber attacks. Foreign contractors quietly abandoned infrastructure projects, claiming instability. Western embassies issued travel warnings, draining tourism revenue overnight. The pressure was designed not only to hit governments, but to sap morale, to convince ordinary citizens that resistance was futile. But Traoré saw through the pattern at an emergency meeting of the AES. He told fellow leaders, "They are trying to turn our people against us. They believe hardship will break us, but hardship is not new to Africa." Dependencies, his words resonated deeply. AIES responded with measures that startled observers. Resource convoys were now escorted by joint security forces. Local banks established payment systems backed by gold to get around Western money transfers. Engineers in Niger and Mali worked through the night to stabilize power grids, while Burkina Faso declared the formation of a national reserve fund financed by oil and gold profits. These were not desperate gestures. They were signals of resilience. The West wanted to corner Africa. Instead, Africa was learning how to stand on its own feet, and each failed attempt to fracture the continent only seemed to tighten the bonds that had once been fragile. The turning point came not from a battlefield, but from a broadcast. One evening, national television cut into regular programming to reveal Ibrahim Traoré standing. At a simple podium, He was not flanked by generals in polished uniforms. Instead, around him stood miners still wearing dust-streaked overalls, farmers with calloused hands, and engineers in worn jackets. Together, they represented a different form of authority. Traore's speech was direct, unrefined, and captivating. "They call us reckless," he said. "I say we are free. From this day forward, they will no longer flow without dignity." The words cut across airwaves carried by radios in villages and streamed on smartphones in bustling cities. The reaction was electric. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight showing barrels of oil wrapped in African flags. In Kinshasa, marketplaces erupted in cheers when the speech replayed across the diaspora. Young Africans posted one phrase: "If Traoré stands, we stand." Internationally, the fallout was immediate. Western media attempted to portray the broadcast as defiant populism. However, the sight of workers standing united with their president struck a chord far beyond the African continent. In South America, activists noted similarities to their own fights against the exploitation of resources. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity for Europe and the United States. The nightmare had materialized. The harder they tried to isolate Africa, the more its leaders appeared not as rebels, but as pioneers. The embargo had failed to fracture Africa. It had forged a new identity. Just when Europe believed the situation could not worsen, a new revelation hit like a thunderclap. An investigative report from the same anonymous European journalist who had exposed the tariff plans surfaced once more. This time it contained leaked correspondence, emails, and draft contracts between Western conglomerates and high-ranking officials. The documents showed that long before the tariff strategy was made public, secret agreements had been prepared to sell off Africa's oil fields and gold mines, disguised as emergency stabilization efforts. The language was chillingly blunt. Oil reserves in Niger were to be leased for 50 years to a consortium of Western firms at cut-rate prices. Gold from Burkina Faso would bypass African treasuries entirely, funneled directly into offshore accounts controlled from London. The plan had never been about tariffs. It was about achieving permanent dominance. When the story broke, outrage swept the continent. In Bamako, crowds stormed foreign company offices demanding accountability in Ouagadougou. Traoré convened another emergency session, his voice measured but firm. Now the mask has fallen. This was never about fairness. It was theft disguised as policy. For ordinary Africans, the revelation hardened resolve. The sacrifices of high prices and shortages suddenly felt less like punishment and more like proof. Proof that their leaders were protecting them from a century-old pattern repeating itself. The fallout was immediate. European leaders scrambled to deny the documents, calling them fabrications. But the details were too specific, the numbers too precise, and the signatures too recognizable. Financial analysts confirmed that the draft contracts were similar to past agreements from the colonial period. For many in Africa, this was not surprising. It was confirmation of what their grandparents had always warned. The chains of dependency had only changed form. Traoré seized the moment. Standing before a packed hall of African parliamentarians, he declared, "They wanted to steal not just our oil and gold, but our future. If we allow this, then every sacrifice our people have endured is meaningless. But if we resist, we turn their theft into our rebirth." The chamber erupted in applause. Across the continent, momentum-built AES leaders announced a joint investigation into all foreign contracts signed in the last 2 decades. Protesters in Dar, Lagos, and Kinshasa carried placards reading "No more hidden chains." Even communities in the diaspora located in Paris and New York organized rallies. They called for transparency from corporations based in the West. The entire focus of the issue had changed. What began as a tariff dispute had transformed into something larger, a referendum on Africa's right to control its own wealth. And for the first time in living memory, Africa was not on the defensive. It was the West that scrambled to explain itself, caught in the glare of its own hypocrisy. As the dust settled, one truth stood unshaken. Africa had stood its ground. What began as whispers of tariffs, they no longer shout for higher wages only. They shout for his resignation. The banners carried on the streets say it clearly. Macron, step down. Brothers and sisters, the empire that once stood tall is now trembling. France thought it could survive without Africa, but the truth is written in the smoke of its streets. Africa has cut the lifeline, and the French citizens are now paying the price. They cannot eat promises. They are unable to pay their bills with rhetoric. They find it impossible to illuminate their homes without a source of uranium. The public's anger is no longer restrained. It is no longer polite. It is raw. It is fierce. It is fire. And when citizens rise in such numbers, governments shake. Brothers and sisters, if you walk through the streets of France today, you will not hear the sound of laughter or music. You will hear the heavy sound of marching feet, of drums beaten in anger, of voices raised against a system that no longer serves the people. Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux. Every city is now filled with protests. They block highways. They ignite fires in public structures. Their demonstrations continue day and night as they refuse to be silenced. Law enforcement is present everywhere, clad in armor, holding shields and prepared with tear gas. But even with all their power, they cannot silence the crowds. For every protester pushed back, 10 more rise from the corners. For every barricade broken, another one is built. The air smells of smoke. The ground is stained with fire. And the people are shouting one name louder than all others: Macron. The workers shout for better wages. They say they cannot live on crumbs while prices rise every month. Inflation has eaten their salaries. What once bought food for a week now barely buys food for 3 days. The price of gas, electricity, and bread continues to increase, while their income stays the same. Retirees are protesting against the freeze on their pensions. They dedicated their entire lives to working and fulfilling their obligations. And now, in their old age, the government tells them their money will be locked. They march with sticks in their hands and fire in their hearts, saying, "We will not suffer silently." The youth, jobless and restless, shout against unemployment. Factories are closing, companies are leaving, and the future looks dark. They say, "How can we build a life if the state gives us no chance to work?" Their anger burns the hottest, for they see a future stolen before it even begins. And the government, instead of listening, continues with arrogance. Ministers argue, prime ministers are changed again and again, but nothing changes in the lives of ordinary citizens. The legislature discusses budgets, deficits, and reforms. In the streets, however, people are concerned with hunger, rent, bills, and survival. The divide between the rulers and the ruled has become so vast that it seems like two separate nations. One in the palaces of Paris, the other in the broken streets. This is why the people no longer believe in reforms. They do not want promises anymore. They want Macron gone. They want the whole system to be broken and rebuilt. Every day the protests grow louder, and every day the police respond with more force. Tear gas clouds the air. Water cannons spray. Rubber bullets fly. But instead of scaring the people, these actions fuel the fire. Mothers march with their children. Workers link arms in solidarity. Students refuse to leave. When the police brandish their batons, the chanting only intensifies. Macron did Macron resign. The state is fighting its own people. And in that fight, it is losing legitimacy. Because when a government fears its people, that government is already broken. Let us not forget the root of this fire. France is not burning only because of pensions or wages. France is burning because the empire has lost its lifeline. For decades, it survived on Africa's resources, but now Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have shut the door. Uranium is gone, gold is gone, cotton is gone. Inexpensive resources are no longer available. Without Africa, France's vulnerability is clear. The populace may not voice it directly, but this is the underlying reason their lives are deteriorating. Their anger is not only against Macron, but against the fall of the empire that once fed them. Brothers and sisters, no nation falls in silence. When an empire begins to collapse, the signs are written everywhere. in its banks, in its factories, in its streets, and in the eyes of its hungry citizens. France today is that empire in collapse. Its economy, once praised as the engine of Europe, is now choking under the weight of its own weakness. The first and loudest sign is the debt. France is drowning in a 3.3 trillion euro deficit. This mountain of debt increases by nearly $5,000 every second. Consider that for a moment. By the time a man is done eating his bread, the national debt has already increased. Before a woman boils her pot of rice, the deficit has climbed higher. This is not just a number written in government papers. This is a burden that presses on every citizen's shoulder. It means higher taxes, smaller pensions, and fewer public services. Then comes the wound of unemployment. 57 major companies have already collapsed, shutting down factories and offices, throwing workers into the streets. Families who once lived with dignity now line up at food banks. Young people with degrees cannot find jobs. Skilled workers who built cars, machines, and industries now sit idle, their hands heavy with frustration. Every person without a job becomes another demonstrator in the streets. Hunger will not be ignored. It finds its voice in fire and chants. France's political system is breaking under this pressure. In just 14 months, the government has collapsed 4 times. Prime ministers come and go, replaced like broken tiles on a leaking roof. But the water keeps pouring in. Parliament is filled with arguments, promises, and empty debates. But the reality outside is harsher than any speech. The people see no difference between left or right, conservative or liberal. All they see is failure, and so they turn their anger toward the president himself. Macron, as the face of the government, has become the symbol of its failure. And regarding electricity, even the famous lights of Paris are no longer guaranteed. For decades, France's nuclear plants were powered by uranium obtained cheaply from Niger. But when Niger cut that supply, the plants faltered. 2 major reactors have already shut down, and the cost of energy has tripled. Families cannot pay their bills. Industries cannot keep up with expenses. And the winter grows colder each year. Imagine Paris, once called the city of light, now struggling to keep its lights on. This is not just symbolic. It is the truth of a falling empire. All these issues, the debt, unemployment, failing companies, unstable governments, and the electricity crisis, erupt onto the streets as fire. These problems fuel the demonstrations. Every banner raised against Macron is a symbol of hunger. Every tire burned is lit with debt. Every chant is a cry against poverty. This is why the protests do not die. Because the crisis is not only political, it is economic. And no speech can stop an empty stomach from roaring. The French leaders are desperate. But their desperation only adds more fuel. Freezing pensions, cutting budgets, reducing services. These only deepen the anger. Instead of mending the injuries, they are adding insult to them. Consequently, the fire intensifies, the protests expand, and the calls against Macron become more vociferous. France is facing not only a political crisis, but an economic collapse that touches every home, every family, every worker. In Paris, the cry echoes across the boulevards, Macron demon. In Lyon, the banners are painted with the same words. In Marseille, the chants shake the old streets. Macron, step down. It is no longer about pensions alone, no longer about wages alone. It is personal. The people see Macron as the one who has failed them, the one who has ignored their pain, the one who spends his energy on foreign speech while his own people starve. The chants are loud, the fires are bright, and the anger is raw. It is not only Macron. The entire political elite is under attack. The public asserts that the ruling class has let them down. They argue that ministers and officials enjoy comfortable lifestyles, while regular citizens bear the weight of debt and inflation. They point to repeated changes in prime ministers, to endless debates in parliament, and they see nothing but failure. The people no longer believe in the system, they no longer believe in the elites, and so they aim